as is also pointed out in the chat. So if you do not want to be on camera, please turn off your camera. Next slide, please. If you have any questions during this webinar, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat, so then we will answer them. Yeah, why are we, first to answer, why are we organizing this webinar? The far-right movement has grown a lot in the EU Parliament over these elections, and this gives them a stronger voice, and the EVP will be more likely to go over extreme right to get the majority of the votes. And this can have enormous consequences for human rights and the environment. Besides, also on a national level, we see far-right parties gaining power. For example, as is happening now in the Netherlands. And the effects that this can have is, for example, that through their anti-immigrant policy, the far right pleads for ethnic homogeneous states and valuing the lives of white Europeans more than non-white Europeans. And also sexual and reproductive rights, including abortion, may face more oppositions due to the conservative sound advocating for traditional family values. And there's also a fear of defunding groups who fight for queer rights in Europe. First off, Joe Inwood from CAN Europe and Noor Dijkstra of WECF will reflect on the scorecards on the scoreboard. Yeah, how this reflects to the outcome of the EU elections. After this, we have Milana, who will elaborate on the situation of in the candidate country Georgia and how the outcomes of the elections affect the situation there. And lastly, we'll end with Renske from the Goede Zaak, and she will share on the normalization of the far right and the responsibility of NGOs. What the responsibility of the NGOs is in countering this movement. And the last 5 minutes we will wrap up, and you can have time to ask some questions. So now I would like to give the floor to Joe. Joe Inwood is an EU election campaigner at CAN Europe, and we'll start today.
Thanks very much, Suzanne, and thanks to WECF for inviting me to speak at this really important conversation. So my name's Joe Inwood, my pronouns are he, him. I'm the EU elections campaigner at Climate Action Network Europe. And I will speak really briefly because I think it'll be interesting to hear reflections, questions, and crucially, points of hope during the discussions after, because the picture that I have to present is exactly reflecting on the outcomes of the elections and some of the challenges that we face. So on the next slide, you'll be able to see the scoreboard that was mentioned by Suzanne. You may have seen this in different formats during the campaign that just happened, but this is something we developed as CAN Europe together with some other environmental European NGO networks, so the European Environmental Bureau, Transport Environments, WWF, and BirdLife. And this scoreboard was a way of analysing the last 5 years, looking at the track records of the politicians in the European Parliament, and really giving them a clear score out of 100 based on did they stand up for ambitious, urgent action on the triple planetary crisis, on climate, on nature, and on pollution. And integrated into those three categories, there was the just transition, and there were other kind of elements of social justice, and ensuring that we marked the politicians fairly based on their track records. The results you see here for the entire Parliament, I think they're probably not too surprising for many of us, but I just wanted to draw attention to the results for the Identity and Democracy group, which got 6 out of 100, and the European Conservatives and Reformists, which got 10 out of 100. So you can see that the track records of the furthest to the right in the Parliament were really poor and really potentially could be worse in the next 5 years. So this is the scoreboard that we put together as CAN Europe. And it was interesting to see as well the Ecofeminist Scorecard that WECF put together. And I think there were some interesting things to compare between those two. But this was all looking at the last 5 years. Looking at the next 5 years, on the next slide, you know the results of the elections, so I won't spend too long on what happened. But the results is broadly as projected. In a sense, this was expected. So it was projected like this for some time. But at the same time, there were some elements that were maybe more unexpected. So one first thing to say is that there was a really significant rise for the far right, but not as significant as some had feared, and as some projections were indicating earlier in the year. But at the same time, there were really significant losses for the Greens group, which returned to its size about 10 years ago, and the Liberals group, Renew, which also saw some big losses, particularly in France, Spain, Italy, and Greece. There's a mixed picture when you look across Europe. For example, in some of the Nordic countries, you see a really strong performance from Greens and Social Democrats, for example, in Denmark, in Sweden, and elsewhere. But then broadly looking at the whole parliament, we see that there will still be this grand coalition, which is the centre-right, the centre-left, and the Liberals. When you put them together, they do still have a majority for confirming a lot of the key posts. And we expect providing continuity for the Green Deal, working with the Greens rather than the ECR and the ID groups. So this is the reflection on the results. And then I guess my kind of final takeaways on the next slide would be about what this might mean. And this is from the perspective of CAN Europe, working on climate and energy issues. We know there will be this rightward shift in the balance of power in the parliament. We know that we will need to involve the European People's Party in these majorities that come together to pass urgent action. But we also know that there will likely be more prehistoric thinkers, protectors, fewer, and fewer procrastinators. So we might see, polarization in the parliament depending on the issue on the table. But we still think that it's important to work hard to build these coalitions between the centre-right, the centre-left, the Liberals, and the Greens on a case-by-case basis. And we will always make the case, to politicians across the spectrum that climate action is really urgently needed and needs to happen in a socially just way. At the same time, we have these shifts in narrative around climate action. So we're hearing more and more these days about competitiveness, growth, industrial policy, and so on. But as CAN Europe, we'll continue saying what we've always said, which is that money for industry needs to come with clear conditionalities. It needs to come with social conditionalities, environmental conditionalities, to ensure that the money that's going into Europe's industrial policy is actually really green and not just serving those kind of the risks that are there around corporate capture. Then finally, the fact that the ECR and ID groups will have more power institutionally in the parliament, including potential rapporteurships on particular policy files, so giving them more influence on the day-to-day running of the parliament. That's a challenge that we'll have to navigate. They may also have more influence in the Commission if they have an executive vice president of the European Commission, for example, and that's another challenge that we will need to deal with. So these are some of the questions that we're thinking about, and it would be interesting to hear as well what others are thinking. We also are wondering about how will the far right organize itself, because there are so many issues where the far right is divided. For example, on Ukraine, but on many others, they are not acting in a cohesive way. And how does that present opportunities and challenges? And then also the key question for the parties in the centre, will they be open to dialogue with civil society and to working with us to build more progressive positions? And will the European People's Party work with forces like the Greens and the Liberals and the centre-left, or will they instead turn to their right? And how do we make the case that the best course of action for climate action is to work with parties not further to the right than the EPP? I think that's about it from my side. So I give the floor back to Suzanne.
Thank you. I have one question. As CAN Europe, are you planning on changing your strategy now that the outcomes, that is going more to the right?
So I think that as CAN Europe, we understand that often the best strategy for advocacy is to be consistent and to not change your tune every 5 years. So we will still keep on talking about social justice, climate justice, and ensuring that the EU policymakers hear the voice of civil society, that the climate crisis is a social crisis. And actually, I think, you know, the rise of the far right, in a way, is something that is very linked to the ecological, social crises that we have in Europe. And I think, you know, from our perspective, it would be a mistake to overcorrect to some of these trends in the elections, because ultimately the vast majority of citizens are supportive of more ambitious climate action, because it has so much to offer to people, you know, tangibly in terms of cost of living, in kind of real benefits for citizens. So although, you know, we will be changing maybe the way that we speak about some of the same concepts based on the different audiences, particularly with the EPP, of course, you know, we will be speaking more about competitiveness and some of this industrial strategy. The substance of what we put forward for the next 5 years really will not be different.
Okay, thank you very much. If people still have questions, you can put them in the chat. Then next up, I would like to give the floor to Noor. And Noor Dijkstra created the scorecard for WECF and also will now share some more about her reflections.
Yeah, I kind of mute myself. Thank you so much. Yeah, so from our point of view, well, if you have a look at the scorecard, of course, as Joe said, the results that we saw where the far right gained a lot of traction and gained a lot of seats in the EP are very worrying for our scorecard. If you look at it like this, as you see, the ECR and IND both were scored blue, because at the time of scoring, they didn't put out their manifestos yet, but having reviewed them later on, we've seen that they're mostly red in their scores, and they're, yeah, which is not very surprising given their views on average, which if we now look at the scores that we've given them and then look at the results, we are very worried for the ecofeminist transitional movement, as they're not these groups that have now gained a lot of seats, which is mainly the EPP, ECR, and IND. They've not been supportive of many of our goals, such as make polluters pay or say no to toxic chemicals, which is the one that I want to talk about most today, which is the Pesticide Reduction Act, which was scrapped from the Green Deal. So as Joe said, we can see that the Green Deal is implemented and is likely to continue in some form, but climate action can be reduced greatly, and climate action, which is related to feminism, which is related to pesticides and their effect on our hormonal health, on our fertility, that research and that movement, well, with these wins, I don't think we're going to see much support for it. And if we see the ECR and IND and EPP, all of them didn't mention these effects in their manifestos, and they were not concerned on bringing the pesticides back into the Green Deal, and they were also not concerned on the effects of pesticides or chemicals on female health or general health for that matter. And if we look at the way they've voted in the past, and we see that both the EPP, ECR, and IND, they've all voted with 80%, 90% majority on not reining pesticides in and not having information available for the health effects for farmers, or not having supermarkets be responsible for reining the pesticides in. So these are all things that we've looked at in our scorecards and that they were very adamant on not making policy on. And we see that the groups that were very considerate in regards to the pesticides and their effects on health, those have all lost a lot of seats. So we see the Greens, we see S&D, but also Renew, which were all groups that were looking into this, and they've lost a lot of their seats. Which, yeah, so if you look at our scorecard in terms of ecofeminist topics, it's not a very good outlook with the rise of the far right. And then in addition to that, today I wanted to talk about period poverty, which is something that we've looked at continuously over the past years, which was not included in our scorecard necessarily, but it was something that we always look at, which is how are these parties looking, how are these parties contributing to transformative topics within national politics. And we see, for example, that the EU in the past did pass a lot of legislation in regards to period poverty, and they said that the taxes on it should be reduced or they should be zero. And so far, we only see Ireland putting it to zero. But having these results in the EU Parliament doesn't give us it's a bit of a grim outlook for how much of this transformative climate laws, gender laws, gender equality laws they will pass in the future. And then especially if we see the rise kind of far-right parties and far-right populism across the EU and in the countries, for example, in the Netherlands, it's not to be expected that more action will be taken in the national countries than there will be in the EU Parliament. So seeing this scorecard and seeing how these parties scored, and then looking at how the national governments are now also more leaning towards the right, the kind of more progressive force coming from the EU is less so with these election outlook. And as Joe said, we still have the EPP being a very large center-right party, but then having these kind of ECR and IND come up with a lot of popularity, and having the Greens and S&D kind of lose their popularity means that the EPP is likely to also shift more towards that far right and to have that narrative kind of normalized. So if you look at our scores in our scorecard, other than that's, it's for ecofeminist topics, it's which require more transformative policies and require more action on all groups. It's a very grim outlook to have these election results. But then again, we hope that they will continue on the Green Deal and they will continue on their climate policy, but very radical climate policy, and just keeping it very relevant. That will be more difficult in the coming 5 years than it was. But we should continue our activism in regards to that. But especially on the pesticides, it's a loss that we should try to reduce as much as possible.
Thank you for sharing. Can you also share maybe a little bit more on what do you think that the role of the EU, like, is it going to shift a lot also, that more power is going to the nationals, to the countries, or?
I'm not good. I wouldn't say so necessarily, more in the sense that the EPP is still the largest group. So, and the EPP has this continuous battle within their party between national sovereignty and accepting that from national parties, but also being this founder of the EU Parliament that wants that shared value community and wants to keep that together. So we've seen that continuously in their EU election plans. We've seen that they give a lot of importance to both. So I don't necessarily, them being the largest and Ursula von der Leyen trying to form a coalition, think that we're going to move away from that EU importance in the center. It's just a question of which way it's going to swing. So as Joe said, it might be possible that they still will collaborate with the Greens. It might also be possible that they'll swing more to the right. But I don't think the EPP will have it reduce its importance of the EU institutions overall. But they do also attribute a lot of value to national governments, to national sovereignty. So we've seen them kind of in a bind with a lot of debates regarding this over the past few months, and we've seen them attribute equal value to both. So that's going to be interesting to see on what topics they'll say national sovereignty is more important, and on what topics they'll say no, for this the EU is really central. And we've seen for the Green Deal that they did support that EU power in that legislation, but then we don't I wouldn't necessarily know looking at their manifesto, how they'll swing given these election results.
You're muted, Suzanne.
Oh, yeah.
But if I can jump in, because I see there's a question in the chat from Judy, and it's also directed to Joe, I think, and maybe both to Eleanor and Joe. Is there a risk in adopting the narratives of the right in our own narratives? For example, losing global justice and solidarity narratives in the public. And I was also wondering about that. So I think maybe this is also a good moment to ask that question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's also a real risk, right? So I agree that the question, is there a risk? Yes. I think then the question is also, is there a risk that we, in our advocacy and in our, as we just heard, you know, the new parliament that we have coming in is going to look a little bit different. We still need to get our voices heard, and we still need to, you know, while on the one hand, as civil society, we recognize that the root cause of the climate crisis is in extractivism, it's in colonialism, it's in, to some extent, capitalism. But that is not always going to be something that is heard in terms of the working with the centre right. And there we have to work together on what we do agree, which is that we have to take action to tackle the climate crisis. We can't go backwards, we can't give up the Green Deal, and we need to implement the huge amounts of legislation that was passed in the last 5 years. And maybe that's, if I can slightly answer as well to the other points that were made about the national and the EU level that you were asking about, Suzanne. I think from CAN Europe side as well, this was a European election. It was also 27 different national elections. But also the EU level is not the only one that matters, and there's so much importance that comes from local organizing, from regional, from you know, different levels of public authority. So there, you know, in particular also in implementing EU decisions and in actually making sure that things are done in a socially just way, in a way that takes into account gender justice. And I think that doesn't go away because of the results of the European election. The results of national elections, regional elections, you know, are just as important, if not even more important, in this new context.
Thank you. Noord, would you also like to contribute to this, or?
I would say I completely agree with Joe in that the main importance is that we stick to these to the narratives that we had, and to the importance of reiterating them and having them not lose their relevance. That's a lot of, I think that's the most important part. Looking at the scores that we attributed to these parties is keeping the topics relevant, despite the fact that they would not necessarily spotlight them as much as we want them to, and keeping that activism going and keeping these topics in every conversation, national level, local level, EU level, because it's not to be ignored just because they don't necessarily attribute that much value to it, first off. And I think reiterating them in every conversation and keeping that activism on, we will not lose sight of these narratives, and they will continue being there. That being said, it is important to also include, to be open in that conversation, to get them across. And I think that's something that we need to be very mindful of seeing this shift towards the far right. To have a productive conversation, I think we should also have that understanding of, okay, how do we form an effective counter narrative that is actually received by these parties, to get our points that we want to highlight and to across, and to have them not lose their relevance.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, there's one more question, and after that question we can go to Milano. Far-right parties often do not recognize the climate crisis as a fact, for example, the AfD in Germany. How to go about it in advocacy for climate justice? Not sure who will take this question.
I don't know if either Noor or Joe, yeah.
I noticed. Thank you for the question, Carolina. I know that you said from the German Women's Council, so I would be interested to hear a German perspective actually on this question. Sorry to kind of throw it back, because I know that the different civil society organizations have different approaches on working or campaigning on the question of the AfD in particular, because it is a huge challenge when you have politicians that just will not recognize scientific reality. And on some organizations would say they just do not engage at all with the far right. And as a network, we follow the lead of our member organizations actually. So some of the member organizations in Germany have a policy of no engagement with the AfD, and I imagine that will not change in the next 5 years.
Thank you. Then we will go. Now we have reflected a little bit on the outcomes of the elections and what this means for the EU and also for ecofeminist topics. And now we would like to give the floor to Milano. Milano Tvaratse is a project coordinator at WECF office in Georgia, and she is a gender sociologist, sorry. And she will tell us more about what the consequences are of these elections on the candidate countries. And at first, I would like to ask you if you can tell a little bit more about the foreign influence.
Yes, I'm a socialist as well, so yeah, good introduction. Thank you, Susan, a lot for organizing this, and I thank all of you, the participants as well. It's an honor for me to be part of this discussion. So I think I will mostly present to you what it means to live under authoritarian regime, and as I live and work in Georgia right now, and of course I will mention it as well about consequences of the EU elections for us. So to give you some background, Georgia applied for EU membership in 2022 and was granted candidate status in 2023. But let me be clear there that it was not initiated from the government because the Prime Minister at this time explained and announced that Georgia will not apply for the EU membership with Ukraine and Moldova in 2022, but in 2024. So basically, after his announcement, tens of thousands of demonstrators marched in Georgia, in Tbilisi, to demand EU membership, and we basically forced our government to change its discourse and to apply for EU membership, and they did so. But it does not mean that Georgia's government and the ruling party, Georgian Dream, is a pro-European political power, not at all. Quite on contrary, it's an authoritarian regime, basically. And the turning point, I think it's important also to highlight in the context of Europe as well, the turning point for them to change Georgia's pro-European path was the full-scale war, Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine. They never ever mentioned that Russia started full-scale war in Ukraine, and Russia still occupies 20% of Georgia's territory, and they never claimed Russia as the main threat to Georgia's existence and democracy. So I think it explains a lot why and how the ruling party of Georgia started sabotaging Georgia's European future. And instead of taking relevant steps and fulfilling the conditions specified in the EU Commission's report, they started initiated a bunch of laws that you see on this slide that go against Georgia's democratic values, but also against EU aspirations. So last 2 years, so basically after the war, once Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, these 2 years have been extremely challenging for Georgia, and we are still facing a very difficult time as these initiated bills coming from the ruling party show how the democracy is weakening step by step. So this spring, the ruling party re-initiated the law on foreign influence, which has been withdrawn actually last year after the mass protest in March 2023. So the law would basically require media outlets, NGOs, and other non-profit organizations to register as pursuing the interest of a foreign power if they receive more than 20% of funding from abroad. So basically, this is the same law as we call it Russia-style law, as Russia adopted in 2012, and as the same law was adopted in Nicaragua, in Belarus, and in Kyrgyzstan recently. So this is the basically law to silence and civil society organizations and free media, and to shrink place for that. So this decision was strongly criticized, of course, not only in Georgia by the vast population, but like the majority of the population of Georgia, by the president of Georgia, public defender's office, but also by the European Union, our foreign partners, even Venice Commission also strongly criticized it. But our government actually adopted the law. And it came into force in June, but we don't know the final version of this law, as some bylaws still remain publicly unavailable. So what is the path? What's really happening in Georgia? How the government managed to shrink the space for civil society organizations and for media outlets? Actually, it is important to point out that all authoritarian regimes, like Georgian Dream is right now, considers free media and CSOs as real threat. The organizations that are working on women's rights, climate issues, minority rights, and all the social inequalities that exist in developing or underdeveloping countries. So they are also fueled and influenced by the anti-gender campaigns that are taking part over the past decade in Europe. And they are initiating bills on family values and protection of minors, which restricts clearly LGBT and queer rights in Georgia. And also they are not only initiating bills and taking actions, but they are deliberately targeting feminist activists, climate and queer activists. So in the countries like Georgia, where the democracy is still fragile, if it exists, and the political institutions are not very stable, it really raises a lot of hate speech and violence against queer activists, feminist activists, and climate activists. So in this context, what are the implications of the EU elections for Georgia, European elections, the result of the European election, but also the upcoming parliamentary elections in France will not only shape, if it's not a strong word, the future of the EU, but the future also of Georgia and the Caucasus region, and also Eastern European countries. It will have influence on Ukraine and Moldova, for instance, as well, because the configuration of the elections show that far-right members of the EU Parliament will be enabled to promote their political agenda, and their political agenda focuses on their respective countries. They are not for EU enlargement. So the countries like Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine that want to be part of the European Union, I'm not sure if this idea will be supported. I don't think so by far-right populists that are gaining places at European Parliament. Also, they want to simplify or completely cancel European Green Deal. They are very Eurosceptical, as I already mentioned, and some of them are having very good and tight relationship with Russian regime and Putin, and they are not even condemning full-scale war in Ukraine. As well, they don't see the need of supporting the Eastern European countries or Caucasus region to build our resilience and to help our democracies to resist, and to help us also to be a part of the European Union. And also, I'm not sure, we will see, I think, during these 5 years, but it will have also implications of the resource allocation to the countries like Georgia. So thanks to foreign funds coming from the European Union, for instance, we are able to work on queer topics, inequality, on climate and environmental issues. And we are now having struggled to think that it will be the case or not anymore. But other than that, other than resources, it will have direct implications in terms of ideological influence, because as like far right, the rise of the far right and populist parties after this election gave kind of a green light to our authoritarian regime, and ruling party now like Georgian government perpetuates anti-democratic and anti-European values, and saying that in Europe, actually, European population is mostly conservative and liberal democracy is not their real choice, and ecofeminism is not real choice, and they are in complete denial of climate crisis, etc. So it will have two main implications, like ideological implications and resource-wise also. We are not sure if we will be supported to maintain our work as CSOs and media outlets if they are not receiving support. And we are not sure if after the election that are scheduled in Georgia on October 26, 2024, if we will be able to start like changing our government. We are hoping to do so if we will start negotiations like EU's further enlargement. I think, yeah, that's all what I can say. And if you have questions, of course,
Thank you.
I'm ready to answer.
Let me check. Yeah, maybe very briefly, you can, somebody asked like, Milano, thank you so much. Could you say a bit more about the status of the family values and protective minors, and who is promoting it in and outside of the government?
Basically, this law is promoted by the ruling party, the government of Georgia. So what happened that they started hearing this law today. Let me check. Yes, like 4 parliamentary committees drafted this law, and they started human rights committee started hearing about this law today at the Parliament of Georgia, and they want actually to adopt this law in September. So as I already mentioned, it will restrict and demolish completely LGBTQI+ rights and queer rights, and their work won't be possible anymore. It is supported by the ruling party, which has majority but not constitutional majority, and it is also supported other far right proxies or far left proxies, and the media outlets that are financed and fueled from Russian Federation. Yeah, if I answered to your question.
Thank you. It's unfortunate that, the perspective is not so bright, unfortunately. Then lastly, we would like to invite Renske, who works as a campaigner at De Goede Zaak. And Renske, you are now working on a campaign against the normalization of the far right. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, of course. So what we've seen is that the far right adopts a similar playbook, no matter what country it's in. And I mean, I think a lot of the examples from Georgia, we see them on a smaller scale in the Netherlands, and we've also seen in Poland and in France kind of how the far right within and outside of a government can definitely change not only laws, but also the way that we look at certain things, so our discourse. And the campaign that we are doing is very, I don't have a PowerPoint, so you're just going to have to listen to me talk. But it's very much about the normalization of the far right. And basically what we see that works is to give a counter argument every time that anything from the far right is being normalized. I think what a lot of NGOs do and what a lot of political parties do is that they try and stay under the radar as much as possible until something is really, really not okay, and then they speak out, but then it's already normalized past such a point that it's really difficult to change the framing. So what we've seen that works is to push back not only on kind of from leftist groups, but also from middle groups and more liberal groups, and trying to convince them to push back as well. And that is the effective way to kind of counter it. But it means that you have to convince groups that are very used to either being in a position of power or not being so criticized to all of a sudden show solidarity, even though they are not often used to having to do so.
Okay, and you already mentioned it very briefly, but how would you define the far right and the tactics that they use?
Yeah, so I think defining the far right is quite difficult, but how we define it is that it tries to undermine rule of law to a certain extent, and what we've seen is that it uses the same tactics every time. So it has kind of 7 steps. It sometimes in some playbooks it says it has 12 steps, but what we see is basically the rundown that it always starts with weakening your rule of law. So we call this deli slicing, so how meat is being sliced in a very non-vegan manner, but like how meat is being sliced in these tiny slivers, and then so you don't really notice that anything of the rule of law is being changed. So we see that happens by just insulting journalists or calling judges into doubt, but then also making it more and more difficult. So like you saw in Poland, that the public broadcast was being taken down. Or what you see in the Netherlands is that there's a lot of police violence. Like that's already the rule of law when it comes to demonstration that's being cut down. But because it's done often over the back of demonstrators that aren't that popular in the first place, so maybe climate protesters that are gluing themselves to a road, or maybe pro-Palestine protesters in a country that isn't very happy about these protests, we see that on those notes, the rights are often being infringed upon first pretty slowly, and then it happens all at once. So that's the most important thing. And then the steps that follow after is that journalists are in a weakened position. So misinformation is being spread. I think we all see this happen as well. The next step that we see is that normal and kind of a racial purity narrative is being promoted. So in the Netherlands, you saw that Wilders for the EU elections actually posted an AI-generated image of like a fully white family saying, well, this is the future that we can have in Europe. Like that's definitely the normalization of this racial purity narrative. And because it's so heavy, it's often really difficult for us to kind of say, hey, this is really not okay. Because we would like to, I think, be more optimistic about our fellow humans, but there are politicians also in Germany that are really very overtly promoting these kind of narratives, and then there are ones that are covertly, for example, via AI images, promoting this narrative. With that also comes promoting the nuclear family, so 1 man, 1 woman, and their children. And from these 2 narratives comes obviously the scapegoating of anyone who doesn't fit into that. So that's refugees, that's trans people, that is basically any group that we already see being blamed for whatever issue there is in a country. And that's the 6th step in this playbook as well, is that there's a very easy solution to any big worries that you as a voter might have. So in the Netherlands, the housing crisis is really big. And then the one thing that is going to come up every time is that all these houses are filled with refugees. Instead of what's actually the case is that there are a lot of free houses in the Netherlands. They're just way too expensive. But it's way easier to just say that there's people in this house that belongs to you because you are a white Dutch nationalist person. You should have that house. So that's a way easier answer to give. And then the last one that we see is astroturfing, which I'm going to go into just very slightly because it's a big thing, but it's basically pretending to be a grassroots activist to push your political agenda, but actually not being a grassroots activist. And we see this in the worried moms that you, for example, see in the US councils a lot, in school councils that try and push for very transphobic or very non-feminist policy, or like you see in Europe with the farmers' protest. What we often see is that these are not grassroots activists. We see often that they are being funded by really big companies that are in the dairy industry. And they fund a lot of the protests, and that's called astroturfing, because it's not actually protesting because they believe in one thing and they want to make a change, and don't actually have any power except for this protest. But they actually already have a lot of power, and they now use the image of the grassroots protests to push for solidifying this status quo narrative. So to push back against, for example, a restoration law in the EU.
Thank you for explaining this. As a follow-up question, I would like to ask, like, what do you think that the role of civil society should be? How can they resist? And do you think that they are resisting enough at this point?
Yeah, I think they are definitely not resisting enough, and they haven't for a very long time. And that's why we're where we're at right now. And I think that that's difficult. And then it's also difficult to realize, okay, how do we get back from that? But what we've seen in Poland, where they've actually successfully moved the far right party out of, not out of government, but out of this position of solidified power, is that they found their common denominator, and they really pushed together for that. So they tried to find a coalition that can agree on one thing. And here the bar was extremely low. It was just democratic policy. It's like, it's an extremely low bar, but it does work. That was one thing that really worked. And one other thing that worked is to show solidarity with first-time targeted groups. So, for example, the queer community knows what it's like to be discriminated, and knows what it's like to receive state-sanctioned violence and oppression. But for example, for judges or journalists, it's the first time. And what worked really well in Poland was that the queer community said to these journalists, we know what it's like, and know that we're going to stand behind you and we're going to stand with you. And that is a tactic that works really, really well. And a third way that is actually always really successful, and that I see very little of in the political field, but also in the NGO field, is to always advocate for something as well as against something else. So we often advocate against the normalization of the far right, but then we don't provide people with an alternative of the world that we would like to see. So what often works is to say, okay, we want less cars, but then we want more trains, or we want less pollution, and then we want more clean air, and we're gonna get it in this way. And then you basically provide an alternative against the very cynical politics, because people do get tired of the far right. Like, even the far right gets tired of the far right because they are always angry. And I think that what worked, or I think science thinks that what works really well, is to also provide a different option to that. So while fighting against something, you also need to know what it is then that you're fighting for, so that the moment people look away from the far right point of view for 1 second and look to you, you have to offer them something.
Thanks. And then as a final question, you mentioned also showing solidarity, and yeah, how can we build a stronger and more effective movement against the far right?
Yeah, so there's, I mean, I could talk about that for a really long time, but what we've seen that works is to find ways online and offline that strengthen each other. So to really use the fact that if you're an NGO, you probably have a big mailing list or a big following, but you also have ways to get people out on the street, and that these two are very good mobilization tactics to also get more people than just your regular crowd to join. Sorry, I have a little cat that wants to be in the video as well. And something else that that works when building a solidarity movement is also that you have to take the step when it's scary, because you are setting the status quo as these NGOs. Like, you have a lot of power, and I think a lot of NGOs think, oh, but compared to the government, we don't. But you do set the status quo. And if 8 big NGOs say, okay, we are really against this law that is currently being passed, even if you're climate NGOs and it's about queer rights, you can still say, hey, this is not normal. And that's something that a lot of groups find very scary, to step outside of basically what is their defined bounds. Like, no, we're only a climate group, or we're only this group. But what we've seen works well is that you set the status quo. People look up at you. They think you're an authority, and you are, because you are knowledgeable. They trust you. They often donate to you. If you then speak up, then also these queer groups, for example, will speak up in your favor again as well. Or if you speak up for right to protest or right to free press, then it will come back to you as well. But it also has to start with saying, hey, I disagree with this, and to basically speak up also when it's kind of outside of your field, because this boxing in is super easy for the far right. It just means that they can focus on one box at a time, and everyone else will stay quiet because they're so afraid to be targeted.
Gonna
Thank you.
jump in for the last question from the chat that I didn't want to miss. Is that Julie asked the same question as she asked before. What is your answer to the question I asked to Joe? Is there a risk in adopting the narratives of the right to our own narratives? And I'm also very curious what you think about it.
Yeah, I think that risk is huge. I think we already see it in the climate movement, that we are scared to mention certain topics because we're afraid that the far right is not gonna go along with them. But that means that they have shifted the frame in the Overton window. The far right is not just 2 parties in the EU government. The far right is also Renew and the Socialists and Democrats that signed for a refugee bill and a migrant bill that is the most inhumane bill that we've seen in the EU history. Like, that's also the far right that we shift over and over, and NGOs do it as well. There is something to say for picking your target audience and a time and place to say certain things. The thing that is very important there is that there also has to be this understanding that you as an NGO can educate your people, and you also can educate politicians. So there definitely is this risk. But then you also have to ask yourself, why are you advocating for these things? And you do have a moral obligation to say something about it. But of course, think about who you are talking to. But if you're talking to kind of the wider public, our research really shown that basically the people are a lot more progressive and left-wing than the parties that they vote for. So even the ID voters often still don't have these really, really intense points of view as the politicians do. So if you're speaking to kind of the broader audience and you're not lobbying towards a specific party, I would really try and promote an as progressive ideal as possible, because these are also the members of these parties that are going to change their minds as well. So if you can speak to the wider public, I would really push to go for something that is as progressive and as inclusive as you can make it, because most people will actually understand it.
Thank you for your powerful message, I think. I think both NGOs and also people who listen today have something, can get a message from this, from your story. So thank you for that. And with this being said, I would like to wrap up today's webinar. I would like to thank all of the speakers, of course, who joined, and of course also the audience. And I hope that we gave an insight today on the current situation and on the future of Europe or the European Union. And the recording will be shared afterwards. And with this being said, I hope to see you at the next exchange.
Thank you.
You.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.